On the outside, they looked perfect. Students, soldiers, parents, caregivers. But behind the uniforms and bright futures were dark secrets. Jealousy, anger, and betrayal turned into shocking crimes that destroyed innocent lives. These are the true stories of how promising paths collapsed into tragedy. Number 1. Diane Zamora. Diane Michelle Zamora grew up in North Texas and was known for her discipline and ambition. From an early age, she was a student who stood out. Teachers often described her as hardworking, focused, and someone who would go far in life. She dreamed of serving her country and becoming an officer, and by her teenage years, she was already preparing for the United States Naval Academy, one of the most respected schools in the nation. By 17, her dream seemed to be coming true. She received admission into the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where only the brightest and most determined young men and women are accepted. Her family and friends were proud. Diane was stepping into a future filled with promise, wearing a uniform that symbolized honor and service. At the same time, she was in a serious relationship with David Graham, another ambitious teenager. David was preparing to enter the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado. To everyone around them, Diane and David were the perfect couple. They were intelligent, disciplined, and highly motivated. People thought they would marry one day, build successful careers, and become role models for others. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind their polished image, their relationship was far from perfect. Diane and David were caught in a cycle of jealousy, insecurity, and constant pressure. Their relationship was passionate, but also toxic. Both of them expected complete loyalty, and both struggled with trust. For Diane, love was not just about affection. It became about control and proof of commitment. The turning point came when David confessed to Diane that he had been with another girl. The girl was Adrienne Jones, a 16-year-old high school athlete from Mansfield in the Dallas-Fort Worth suburbs. Adrienne was described by friends and teachers as kind, cheerful, and popular. She loved running track and was focused on her own future. She had no idea that a brief encounter with David would drag her into a dangerous situation. Diane could not let go of the thought that David had been with someone else. She believed her honor had been stained and that David needed to prove his loyalty to her in a dramatic way. According to testimony later given in court, Diane told David that he had to kill Adrienne to prove his love. It was a shocking demand, but David agreed. Their relationship had become so twisted that murder seemed like a way to hold on to each other. On the night of December 4th, 1995, Adrienne Jones left her home, believing she was going to meet David. She never returned. The next morning, her body was found on a rural road in Grand Prairie, Texas. She had been shot and beaten. The crime scene shocked investigators because Adrienne was a bright, innocent teenager with no enemies. At first, the case went cold. Police had few leads, and Adrienne's friends and family were left in grief and confusion. Months went by without answers. Then, in an unexpected twist, the truth began to unravel hundreds of miles away. While at the Naval Academy, Diane reportedly spoke about the crime in front of her roommates. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was her need to share the secret. But her words did not stay hidden. The roommates were horrified by what they heard and eventually told the authorities. Once investigators began to look closer at Diane and David, the pieces started to fit together. Phone records, witness statements, and movements on the night of the crime all pointed toward the young couple. Texas police moved quickly, and on September 6, 1996, both Diane Zamora and David Graham were arrested. The trial gained national attention. People were shocked that two teenagers, both Service Academy students, could be accused of such a violent act. The contrast was striking. Polished uniforms and promising futures on one hand, and the brutal murder of an innocent girl on the other. In February 1998, a Texas jury found Diane Zamora guilty of capital murder. Because Adrienne's parents requested that the death penalty not be pursued, Diane was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole for 40 years. David Graham was tried separately, convicted, and also sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was filled with emotions. For Adrienne's parents, it was a moment of accountability, though nothing could bring back their daughter. For classmates and cadets who had once admired Diane and David, it was an unbelievable fall from grace. For the public, it was a cautionary tale. The appearance of success and honor can hide deep emotional flaws. Over the years, Diane has tried to appeal her conviction. In 2018, she petitioned the United States Fifth Circuit Court, but her request was rejected, leaving her life sentence in place. She remains in prison today. David Graham also remains behind bars, serving his life term. The case of Diane Zamora and David Graham continues to be studied because it asks difficult questions. How could two intelligent, high-achieving young people throw away their futures so completely? What made Diane believe that murder was the only way to restore loyalty? And why did David agree to such a demand? Some experts say it was about control and jealousy. Others say it was about the pressure of being young, ambitious, and not knowing how to handle betrayal. Whatever the reasons, the outcome was the same. A young girl with her whole life ahead of her was killed, and two promising students ended up in prison for the rest of their lives. Adrienne Jones is remembered by friends and family as a daughter, an athlete, and a bright young woman who deserved a future. Her life was stolen because of someone else's insecurity and obsession. The story of Diane Zamora is a reminder that ambition and uniforms do not equal virtue. Love can inspire greatness, but when twisted by jealousy and control, it can destroy everything in its path. In the end, this case is not about honor or loyalty. It is about the cost of unchecked emotions and the lives they shattered. Number 2. Julie Schenecker. Julie Powers. Schenecker was a woman who seemed to have everything under control. She was in her early 50s, an Army veteran, and a military spouse married to Colonel Parker Schenecker, a respected career officer in the United States Army. The family lived in Tampa, Florida, where Parker served with U.S. Central Command. Friends and neighbors saw them as a disciplined, successful military family. Julie and Parker had two teenage children, Kikes and Bo. Both kids were bright, active students involved in school and sports. Julie was often the parent people saw driving them to practices and events, handling schedules, and taking care of the house while Parker worked long hours or was away on deployment. From the outside, it looked like a stable family. Neighbors described them as normal, friendly, and busy, just like any other military household. But what people could not see was the private struggle Julie was facing. For years, she battled mental illness. Court records and later trial reports revealed that she had been diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder. She had received psychiatric treatment at times, but her struggles never truly went away. On the surface, Julie appeared composed, but behind closed doors, she was deeply unstable. By early 2011, Parker was deployed overseas, leaving Julie at home with the children. This was not unusual for military families, but for Julie, it became overwhelming. Her mental state worsened, and her feelings of isolation grew stronger. What followed shocked her community, her family, and even the country. On the morning of January 2011, Julie used a .38 caliber revolver she had recently purchased. She shot and killed her two teenage children inside and around their home. The act was devastating, not just for Parker, who was thousands of miles away serving his country, but for the community that had trusted and respected the family. When police arrived after a welfare check, the scene was so disturbing that first responders needed counselors to help them process the trauma. Investigators quickly gathered evidence: the gun, handwritten notes, and digital records that showed Julie had thought about what she was going to do. From the beginning, the case stayed in civilian courts. Because Julie was not on active duty, there was no military trial. Prosecutors argued that this was not a random act, but a deliberate choice. They pointed to the fact that Julie had purchased the gun days earlier, waited for the required period, and then carried out the murders. This, they said, was clear planning. The defense, however, presented another side. They argued that Julie was suffering from severe mental illness. Expert witnesses described symptoms of psychosis, suicidal thoughts, and a total collapse of her mental stability. According to them, she was not in her right mind when the killings happened. The trial became a battle of two narratives: insanity versus intent. Prosecutors said Julie was angry with her husband, frustrated with parenting, and took out that anger on her children in a calculated way. The defense said she was delusional and not in control of her actions. When the trial began in 2014, the jury listened to weeks of emotional testimony. Witnesses spoke about Julie's history of mental health struggles, while others focused on her calm planning and the evidence left behind. The jury did not take long to reach a decision. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they rejected the insanity plea. Julie was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, she gave a short statement accepting responsibility and apologizing. But her words did not soften the blow for the families, classmates, or community members who had lost 2 young lives in such a cruel way. The reaction in Tampa was one of shock and grief. Schools held memorials and vigils for Kikes and Bo. Students and teachers struggled to understand how such tragedy could come from a family they thought they knew well. Parker, devastated by the loss of his children, later spoke publicly about honoring them. Over the years, he has worked to support youth and community causes in their names, making sure their lives are remembered not only for how they ended, but for the bright futures they represented. The military community also felt the weight of this crime. Military families are used to hardship, deployments, and separation, but this was different. This was not a loss in combat. This was a loss caused by a parent at home. It forced difficult conversations about mental health, family pressures, and the hidden struggles that can exist even in families that look strong from the outside. Julie tried to appeal her conviction later, arguing that her legal defense during trial was not strong enough. But the courts in Florida rejected her requests. She remains in prison, serving 2 life sentences without parole. Her case leaves behind painful lessons. It shows how untreated mental illness, anger, and isolation can grow into something dangerous if ignored. It shows the damage of silence, how neighbors and even close friends often never see the warning signs until it is too late. Most of all, it is a reminder of the responsibility parents carry. Children look to their parents for love, safety, and protection. When that trust is broken, the consequences are unimaginable. The story of Julie Schenecker is not just about crime. It is about the hidden battles that people face and the need to take mental health seriously. But it is also about accountability. Whatever her struggles, the jury decided that Julie knew enough to plan, to purchase a weapon, and to carry out the killings. The law demanded justice, and justice came in the form of 2 life sentences. Today, her children are remembered not for the crime that ended their lives, but for the joy, laughter, and hope they brought to those around them. Their classmates, friends, and community continue to honor their memory. And their story stands as a reminder that behind the walls of even the most disciplined families, there can be hidden pain, and that ignoring it can come with a cost too high to imagine. Number 3. Kemia Hassel. Kemia Hassel was in her early 20s, serving as a U.S. Army specialist at Fort Stewart in Georgia. On the surface, she seemed like a young soldier doing well in life. She was married, a mother, and a respected member of her unit. To her peers, she looked disciplined, responsible, and balanced. But beneath that image, she was hiding a dangerous secret. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III, was also a soldier, and one who was deeply admired. Tyrone was older, more experienced, and well-respected among his superiors and fellow troops. Friends described him as loyal, hardworking, and a man devoted both to his family and his career. For Tyrone, the military wasn't just a job, it was a calling. From the outside, Tyrone and Kemia looked like the model military couple. They were young, had a child together, and seemed to be building a future. To their community, they appeared steady and happy, but inside their marriage, things were not as they seemed. While serving at Fort Stewart, Kemia began a romantic relationship with another soldier, Specialist Jeremy Quellar. What began as an affair soon grew into something much darker. Instead of ending her marriage or being honest, Kemia allowed her secret relationship to develop into a conspiracy. According to prosecutors, she and Jeremy started to talk about removing Tyrone from the picture permanently so they could be together freely. This was not a plan made in the heat of a single moment. Evidence later showed that Kemia and Jeremy exchanged countless messages, talking about the best time and place to attack. They watched Tyrone's routine, discussed opportunities, and created a cold plan. What started as infatuation hardened into intent. On December 31, 2018, Tyrone was visiting his family in Michigan for the holidays. That night, he stepped outside a home in St. Joseph Township, perhaps to grab something or make a call. It was supposed to be a time of joy, New Year's Eve with family and friends. Instead, it became the moment his life ended. As Tyrone stood outside, he was ambushed and shot. Neighbors were stunned by the sudden violence. Family members rushed out, desperate to save him, but it was too late. The attack was swift, calculated, and final. At first, investigators considered the possibility of a random crime, but soon, evidence began pointing in a different direction. Detectives followed digital traces, messages, phone records, and online activity. Slowly, the picture became clear. This was not a random act. It was a murder planned by Tyrone's own wife, together with her lover. The discovery shocked everyone. In the Army, where loyalty and honor are core values, the idea that a soldier would conspire to kill her husband, another soldier, was almost unthinkable. For Tyrone's fellow troops at Fort Stewart, it was a betrayal that cut deep. When the case went to trial in 2019, prosecutors laid out the evidence step by step. They showed the jury the messages between Kemia and Jeremy. They described how the two had coordinated, how Jeremy carried out the shooting, and how Kemia supported and encouraged the plan. Witnesses spoke about Tyrone's character, his dedication to his family, and the devastation his death left behind. Kemia's defense tried to argue that she had been pressured or influenced, but the evidence of her planning, her involvement, and her choices was too strong. The jury found her guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jeremy Cuellar, the lover who carried out the shooting, took a plea deal. He admitted to second-degree murder and was sentenced to decades in prison, long enough that he will spend much of his life behind bars. The courtroom was filled with heartbreak. Tyrone's parents spoke about their son, a young man with so much ahead of him, cut down not by war or battle, but by betrayal at home. They grieved not only for his life, but also for the future of his child, who would grow up without a father. The Army community also reacted with shock. Soldiers who had served with both Tyrone and Kemia struggled to understand how such a betrayal could happen within their ranks. At Fort Stewart, a memorial service was held to honor Tyrone. Fellow soldiers stood in silence, remembering his dedication and service, while trying to process the painful truth that his life had been ended by someone he trusted most. Kemia later appealed her conviction, arguing that her trial was unfair and that some of her statements should not have been used against her. But the appeals court reviewed the evidence and upheld the original sentence. She remains in prison, serving life without parole. The story of Kemia Hassel is more than just a crime. It is a lesson about betrayal and choices. She had a family, a career, and a future, but she threw it all away for an affair and a plan that destroyed lives. Her child lost both parents, one to murder, the other to prison. The case also raised questions about how personal struggles and relationships can clash with the discipline of military life. In the end, the uniform could not hide the truth. Beneath the surface, Kemia's choices were driven not by duty, but by desire and selfishness. Tyrone Hassel III is remembered not for the betrayal he suffered, but for the life he lived. He was a soldier, a husband, a father, and a man respected by everyone who knew him. His story is honored in memorials and in the lives of those who served with him. The tragedy of Kemia Hassel reminds us that betrayal can cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Trust, once broken, cannot be repaired, and in this case, it cost a man his life, a child their father, and a community their faith in someone they once served alongside. Number 4. Reta Mays. Reta Phyllis Mays was in her mid-40s when her crimes came to light. She had served in the West Virginia Army National Guard, deploying overseas to Iraq and Kuwait in the early 2000s. After her military service, she returned home and later found work as a night shift nursing assistant at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. At first glance, Reta looked like a normal caregiver. She worked the quiet overnight shifts, sitting with older patients, changing linens, and checking on their needs. To the veterans under her care, she was the face they saw in the middle of the night, someone who was supposed to keep them comfortable and safe until morning. Her colleagues thought she was calm, quiet, and capable. But behind this calm image, Reta was hiding something terrible. Investigators later described her as a woman who craved control and carried personal instability into her work. Her job gave her access to vulnerable patients, elderly veterans who had already served their country with honor. And it was in this position of trust that Reta began a shocking series of crimes. Between July 2017 and June 2018, Reta secretly gave insulin injections to patients who did not need them. These patients, mostly older men, were medically stable and in many cases preparing to go home. The unnecessary insulin caused their blood sugar to crash, sending them into sudden hypoglycemia. Because the patients were elderly, their deaths often looked natural. For a time, the pattern of deaths passed without suspicion. But soon, staff at the hospital began to notice something unusual. There was a troubling cluster of low blood sugar emergencies, happening more often than made sense. The VA's Office of Inspector General and the FBI were brought in to investigate. They began carefully reviewing medical charts, interviewing staff, and even exhuming bodies of veterans whose deaths had seemed unexpected. What stood out was one disturbing fact. Reta Mays was on duty during each suspicious case, and while nursing assistants were not supposed to give medications, investigators found evidence that she had access to insulin and was alone with patients. When she was removed from patient care, the strange medical emergencies suddenly stopped. That was the final confirmation that something was deeply wrong. The case moved into federal court because the crimes happened in a civilian hospital, not in the military system. In July 2020, Reta Mays pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. By pleading guilty, she admitted she had deliberately given insulin to patients, knowing it would harm or kill them. In May 2021, she was sentenced. The judge handed down 7 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each veteran she murdered, plus an additional sentence of decades for the assault survivor. In court, the judge called her the kind of predator who hides in plain sight. Families of the victims spoke about their pain, saying fathers and grandfathers who had served their country with honor had been taken from them in a place that should have been safe. The public reaction was a mix of grief and outrage. The VA Inspector General released a report on the same day as her sentencing, criticizing the hospital for serious failures in oversight and medication security. The report said, Reta should never have had access to insulin in the first place. New reforms and safety measures were promised, but for the families who lost loved ones, nothing could undo the damage. In interviews, Reta claimed that she sometimes thought she was easing suffering, or that giving insulin gave her a sense of control. But investigators and prosecutors rejected these explanations. They said there was no evidence of mercy, only a pattern of secret killings. They emphasized that the veterans she targeted were not terminally ill, but men who were stable and, in many cases, about to return home. Psychological reports mentioned her past traumas and struggles with mental health, but the evidence showed planning, concealment, and repetition. She was not acting out of confusion. She was making deliberate choices over and over again. Today, Reta is held in federal prison at the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama. With multiple life sentences and no chance of parole, she will never walk free again. Her case remains one of the most shocking betrayals in the history of veteran care. These men had already served their country and earned rest, respect, and dignity. Instead, they were betrayed in their final days by someone hired to protect them. The families of the victims continue to remember their fathers and grandfathers, not for how they died, but for the lives they lived. Memorials and tributes have been held, and their names are honored in communities across West Virginia and beyond. The story of Reta Mays is a dark reminder of how trust, once broken, can devastate families and damage institutions. It is also a warning that vigilance in healthcare must never fade. For every veteran, every patient, and every family, the lesson is clear. Safety must always come first, and no one should ever have to question whether their loved one is safe in a hospital bed. In the end, the court's judgment matched the gravity of Reta's crimes. 7 lives taken in secret, 7 life sentences stacked one after another. Justice means she will never again have the chance to harm anyone. But for the families left behind, true justice will always feel incomplete, because no sentence can bring back the men who were lost. These stories remind us that uniforms, medals, and bright futures do not always reveal the truth inside. Jealousy, anger, betrayal, and hidden pain turned ordinary people into criminals who destroyed innocent lives. Justice was served, but the victims' voices remain the most powerful reminder. Their names and their futures were stolen, and that loss can never be replaced. What we can do is remember their stories, not for shock, but as warnings of how fragile trust is and how dangerous it becomes when broken.